is Indian Country Today.
Esquili, yes, thank you for joining us. I'm Patty Tholahungva. A judge is stopping the federal government from disestablishing the reservation of the Mashpee Wampanoag tribe in Massachusetts. U.S. District Judge Paul Friedman granted a summary judgment on behalf of the tribe on Friday. Chairman Cedric Cromwell said a billionaire friend of President Trump wants to take the tribe's land out of trust so he can have exclusive gaming rights. The Cape Cod area tribe had 321 acres of land signed into trust by the Obama administration in 2015. Shortly after, Neil Bloom applied for a gaming license and was denied because of a 2011 law that carved out special gaming rights for federally recognized tribes in that state. Federally recognized tribes can only establish casino gaming on land held in trust. The judge called the Interior Department's actions arbitrary, capricious, an abuse of discretion, and contrary to law. He ordered the Interior Department to review the matter and issue new findings. A documentary criticizing the use of Native mascots in sports is in the works. A trailer of the documentary called Imagining the Indian is being released in the wake of the Black Lives Matter protests across the country. Imagining the Indian has a heavy focus on the Washington football team. The filmmakers Aviva Kempner and Ben West say they hope Change the Name movement will gain new traction in the civil rights protests going on at this time. Kempner says she thinks people are finally ready for the change. According to the American Psychological Association, racial slurs and derogatory images have a negative impact on Native youth. The association says it harms identity development and self-esteem. The documentary includes interviews with psychologists, activists, and members of Congress. The full documentary will be finished in 2021. And now for the latest numbers of COVID positive tests in Indian Country, let's go to Jordan Benebigay, our Washington editor. Jordan?
Yate Patty, Yate Shikisto Shidine. Patty, over the weekend, 4 tribes reported more cases and deaths, while 1 tribe in Oklahoma popped up on our radar. So here are the latest numbers from our database. There are 8,848 positive confirmed cases and 347 deaths in the Indian health system. Again, that is a total of 8,848 positive confirmed cases and 347 deaths as of June 8th. The Fort Sill Apache tribe in Arizona said the tribe has a total of 3 positive confirmed cases. There are 670 tribal members in Oklahoma and New Mexico, with roughly 300 members in Oklahoma, they said. Also in Oklahoma, the Cherokee Nation had an increase of 22 cases. The tribe now has a total of 112 total cases. And the Mississippi Band of Choctaw Indians in Mississippi reported 39 more cases and 5 additional deaths over the weekend. This brings the total to 737 cases and 40 deaths in total for the Mississippi Choctaw Indians. And the White Mountain Apache tribe in Arizona announced 97 new cases, giving the tribe a total of 982 cases and 9 deaths. And the Navajo Nation that spans across parts of Arizona, New Mexico, and Utah reported 290 new cases and 13 additional deaths from Friday to Sunday. And tribal officials say they have approximately a total of 6,020 cases and 277 deaths in total, Patty.
Well, quite a rise in numbers. And I believe also the Yakima tribe in Washington has seen a spike in cases. What have we heard from Yakima?
Yeah, Yakima, I haven't checked their latest numbers, but again, like Indian Country Today is doing its best. We're trying to cover over 574 federally recognized tribes, state tribes, and actually Indian Country Today recently partnered with Johns Hopkins University, so we're trying to get more help in collecting data and making the data more comprehensive. Because even the numbers now, we know that is really underreported, especially the deaths too. As you consider the Indian health system is very complicated. You have to think about the direct service facilities under IHS, tribally run facilities, Medicaid, urban Indians, VA hospitals. So there's a lot of gaps that we're trying to shoot for here to get accurate numbers.
Yeah, certainly quite a task keeping track of all the different tribes here. Jordan Benebigay, thank you so much.
Yeah.
And we'll be right back.
This is Indian Country Today.
Welcome back. This is an election year, and in a few months, Americans will be going to the polls to cast our ballots to vote for a number of offices, everything from state offices, U.S. Congress, even the presidency. Yet for Native Americans, this American right isn't so easy to exercise. For the 574 federally recognized tribes, there are barriers that keep them from voting. Those issues are named in a new report from the Native American Rights Fund called Obstacles at Every Turn: Barriers to Political Participation by Native American Voters. Joining us now to discuss the report is Jacqueline De Leon. She's a staff attorney with the Native American Rights Fund and is one of the authors of the report. Welcome, Jacqueline.
Hi, thank you so much for having me.
Your report says voting equals power. Let's first briefly review the 500 years of voter suppression in Indian country. There was a time when governors were calling for the annihilation of tribes and even military leaders. Tell us about some of those examples named in your report.
Absolutely. So there's been a long-standing history of trying to keep Native Americans outside of the political system in the United States. Governors, the former governor of Colorado, for example, called for the annihilation of both the women and children of Native Americans. There were long-standing hostilities between Native tribes and the federal government, no surprise. And so as Native Americans maintained their sovereignty, but were also, integrated into the United States system, the federal government and the states could be hostile and were hostile towards Native American political participation in the American system.
And even newspaper editors, there were editorials that really actually called for the killing of Indians.
Yes, this is a widespread sentiment through the 1800s.
So that's the background that we come from as Native Americans. And of course, just a week ago, we celebrated the passage of the 19th Amendment that granted women, white women, the right to vote. And yet Native Americans didn't get that right to vote. It varied state by state, but in 1924, we were granted citizenship. And then eventually, state by state, tribes got the right to vote. So yet, all these decades later, we're still having issues. So in 2015, NARF established this committee to look at voter suppression. And you actually traveled to a lot of I think every reservation that you held a listening session. What were some of the things that were brought out in those listening sessions that showed voter suppression?
Yeah, so NARF and the Native American Voting Rights Coalition held a series of 9 field hearings across Indian country to just listen to community leaders, organizers, tribal leaders, politicians, academics, really anybody that could speak to the topic of why it is that Natives were voting at such low numbers. And really what we saw across Indian country was a remarkably consistent picture. And that's that it's really hard to vote in Indian country, really hard to vote, really hard to register, really hard to get your ballot counted. And so there was really consistent barriers, things like unreasonable distances to the polls, things like, terrible roads, things that that are very familiar in Indian country, but they all create additional obstacles to the ballot box. More often than not, ballot boxes are located outside of the reservation in a border town, and that border town may or may not be hostile towards Native American people. It's very rare to have Native American poll workers, and so it's not a friendly forum for a lot of Native Americans to go and cast their ballot. So there's a lot of hurdles there that keep Native Americans from voting.
And so these are some of the reasons why, according to your statistics, only 66% of eligible Native Americans who are of voting age are actually registered to vote. That's quite a number who are still, not registered and not voting.
That's right. There's over 1 million Native Americans that are eligible to vote and that are not registered. And that's, even if Native Americans are registered, it's still difficult to ultimately cast that ballot.
And it's also interesting when you think about the history of trying to get these voting rights. In Arizona, a state I'm very familiar with, my home state, is, our history is that first two men, Native men, tried to go vote in the 20s and 1928, and they were denied that because Indians were considered wards of the government. So they had a guardianship. And then after World War II, a Native veteran from Fort McDowell and another man went back to try to register to vote, and they actually were successful. They took their case to the Arizona Supreme Court, and then in 1948, tribes in Arizona were finally given the right to vote. So when you look at how our ancestors, our elders, have fought for that right to vote, what does today's state of the lack of registering to vote and voting say about those early efforts?
Yeah, so I mean, I think what you're talking about is just kind of a crazy thing to think about, right? The states of Arizona's position was that because Native Americans had this guardian ward relationship, that Native Americans were incompetent to cast a ballot. And that's incredibly insulting. And obviously, like you said, that was all the way through 1948. That was the official state position. And even after Native Americans were given, once the state admitted that that was no longer, and the Supreme Court found that that was no longer a reasonable justification, those sentiments didn't just disappear. And they also, I think, left a really harsh legacy where elders felt like they were humiliated when they went to go cast their ballot. If an official was telling you, you're incompetent to vote. The other thing that states did was they would say, you have to renounce, your tribal citizenship in order to cast a ballot. You have to say that you're now civilized in order to cast a ballot. And those kind of really painful types of requirements made it seem as if voting and sovereignty were opposed. And I think that in time, that legacy continued. And really, it's not surprising then that elders teach their children, hey, don't participate in that system. That system is not for us. We have our own system. And really, I think that now, unfortunately, means that Native Americans are not participating at rates that would give us political power. And that power, I think, is really what can make a difference in our day-to-day lives. And we can still maintain our sovereignty and participate in the American system. It was a lie that the states were pushing on us to make us believe that it was opposed, and it's not opposed.
Yeah, it's a crazy history when you go back and look at some of these cases. As recently as 1956 in Utah, the state attorney general that you wrote in your report said Indians who lived on the reservations couldn't vote, but if they moved into the city, then they could vote. And there's an underlying effort in that, in connecting people to the land and whether or not they could vote.
Yes, that's exactly right. So I think that it's not surprising that there's this legacy of feeling like the system isn't ours. But I think that we have to fight against that indoctrination. We have to fight against the propaganda that the states, passed on to us, saying that the system isn't ours, because Native Americans, more than anybody, are entitled to the political power that America has. And we need to all participate so that we can improve our lives.
And another example I want to bring out from your report is that, when people think about voting, they go down to their local precinct, and maybe it's a few blocks away, and either they vote in person or they drop off their ballot, if they're not doing mail-in voting. But tribes face the physical barriers and the distance barriers that you talked about earlier. And so the tribe who lives at the bottom of the Grand Canyon, the Havasupai tribe, in order to vote and to get their ballots counted in the past, somebody, the poll worker, had to hike out of the canyon at 3 a.m. And they had to helicopter in all the ballots to begin with. So those are kinds of barriers that I think most Americans don't even think about when they think about going to the polls and voting.
That's right. So I think that there is this belief that All I do is I went to go get my driver's license when I was 16. I got registered to vote, and then I go down to my local polling place on election day. I cast my ballot, or I get my ballot in my mail in my front door, and I turn it back in. When I go to the grocery store, people are hounding me saying, hey, register to vote. Why is it so hard for these Indians to vote? But the truth is that that's not the reality in Indian country at all. A lot of people don't need driver's licenses. There's no reason on the reservation to get a state issued driver's licenses. We've seen that those state issued driver's licenses can be up to 50 miles away. So a lot of people don't have driver's licenses and they're not automatically registered to vote. So then it becomes, okay, how are you going to register to vote? In the Duckwater Reservation in Nevada, it's 140 miles one way to get in-person voter registration. And so it is not easy to get registered to vote. And then when it gets time to come and cast your ballot, it is not uncommon to be 20, 40 miles off of the reservation, which means that you're traveling a dirt road in November when the weather is bad, and you've got to go and cast your ballot. And then, like I said earlier, face a whole bunch of people that don't look like you in a border town that may not be friendly. And I think that is a really big burden to expect people to execute on election day in order to vote. So, if somebody's saying, oh, it's so easy to go vote, they have not lived the reality in Indian country.
Well, your report also included a story about a woman in South Dakota who noticed as she was driving on the highway that there was an increased number of police officers along the highway. And her allegation was that they were pulling people over for lack of a license, maybe no registration or no insurance, in an effort to keep them from going to the polls. Did you do a little more digging into that case? What happened with that?
That's right. So this was pretty consistent testimony. We heard across different states. In Wisconsin, voters were forced to vote out of a sheriff's office, which was incredibly intimidating. There was a testimony that on election day, there were officers posted on the one road between the reservation and the ballot box, pulling people over, checking license plates, that kind of behavior that indicates that they're fishing for people to pull over for minor violations that kept people away from the ballot box. We also heard in North Dakota, people suspected that there were police pulling increased people over for minor violations. In one town in Arizona, 100 miles from the nearest border, they had a border patrol car parked right outside of the polling place, which was just serving to be intimidating. So, police presence is used to intimidate Native voters.
Wow, that's a topic that hasn't really come up in this whole civil unrest movement that we're seeing right now, but perhaps that's something that people can also address.
Yeah, absolutely.
So the other point that your report brought out is that despite all of this, when Native people do go to the polls, they can sway elections.
Absolutely. So we've seen Native Americans make the difference in elections all over the country. In Alaska, Republican Senator Lisa Murkowski noted that it was the Native vote that pushed her over the top. In Montana, Democrat John Tester says that is the Native vote that made the difference in his election. So, across political spectrums, Native Americans can make a difference in elections. And, we also see that there are numbers of, for example, in the last presidential election, by the margin that was lost in Wisconsin, there are a sufficient number of Native voters to sway that election. There's a sufficient number of Native voters to sway the election in Minnesota. So Native vote can absolutely make a difference in elections all over the country.
So Jacqueline, what are some of the recommendations your report suggests to change the situation and fully empower Native Americans to participate in the voting process?
So there are a lot of ways that Native Americans can increase access. I think a lot of it would be tribal governments reaching out to their local county elections officials to make sure that they have a polling place on the reservation. Tribal governments can also issue voter guides because I know that the ballot can be confusing and it can be intimidating. And so having a tribal voter guide can go a long way to breaking down some of the confusion that can arise about a ballot. If you're an individual, you can encourage your neighbors to go out and vote. You can drive people to the polls because, like I said, those distances are really far. You can get out the vote by just letting people know that you're voting. Letting people know how to vote. I think there's also a big information vacuum. It's not so obvious the way it might be in a city. You know, if a polling location is located 20 to 40 miles off of a reservation, it's not immediately obvious where that location is. So being the person in your community that's telling people where to vote, when to vote, how to vote, that can be really powerful. And just saying that you are voting, not being ashamed of voting, I think also goes a long way in breaking down the stigma against voting. And saying, hey, this is the way that we make a difference in our community. This is the way that we help the children by increasing the services that we get access to is by voting. The way that you vote for, the police chief, you can vote for the county and the district attorney. These are all really important positions that actually make a really big difference in the day-to-day lives of your community. So voting matters.
And that's another area where, again, tribes can come in and help the tribal members understand the voting process. What about addresses and people who share, many people who share the same home address or a PO box? How do you overcome that with suspicion that, hey, how many people can live in one house and vote?
Absolutely. So this is a problem we see all over Indian country, where we know that people share homes. We know that there are sometimes not even an address on a home, so it can be hard to register. Every registration form is required to have a map where you can mark where your home is, even if it doesn't have an address. If you don't see that map, you can email vote@narf.org, and we would get that remedied for you. You can also talk to your tribal government. The tribal governments should work with county officials to see if they can designate a building that can be used as an address to register, because these types of the lack of address and the sharing of homes can make it hard for people to have an address. And just because you don't have an address does not mean that you're not qualified to vote. You are qualified to vote if you're over 18, an American citizen, and if you live within a county.
And what about keeping your voter information updated? Say you have registered, but you've changed your phone number, you've changed your address. How, is that, I think people just tend to forget to update their voter registration information.
Yeah, so it's really difficult, but if you have internet access going online, a lot of times you can update your address that way. You can also sometimes call your county election official and update your address through the phone. And so there are ways to keep your address updated. And if you're in the same precinct, even if you go to vote, you should be able to update your address if you bring like a piece of mail or something like that. So there are ways to update your address, and you should always try and update your address before you vote, and if you have to, on the election day.
And really quickly, in this pandemic, how safe is it going to be to vote?
We have to keep in-person voting options for exactly those reasons, because there aren't addresses in Indian country, and we know that people don't get mail across Indian country. So we have to keep in-person voting places. We can use curbside voting. We can use PPE. We can, have extended early voting so that people can vote in less crowded conditions, and we can use community members as poll workers.
And quickly, where can people find your report once it's published?
It's on the website now at vote.narf.org.
Okay, Jacqueline De Leon, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it.
All right, and thank you for watching. Take care of yourselves. Your life is precious. I'm Patty Tolahungva. Join us again tomorrow.
This is Indian Country Today.